I need to start by saying this. I wish I had never touched that clock. If you're reading this, you might think it's just another creepypasta, another horror story someone made up for fun. But I swear to you, every word of this is real. The things I've seen, the things I've felt, they aren't the kind of nightmares that fade when the sun comes up. They stay with you, creeping in the edges of your mind, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. I know, because even now, after everything, I still hear the ticking. And sometimes I feel time slipping away. It started 2 years ago when my uncle, Robert Caldwell, passed away unexpectedly. I say unexpectedly, but the truth is I don't think anyone really knew what was happening to him in those final months. He had been changing. Before, he had always been sharp, meticulous even. He was a retired history professor, a collector of rare antiques, and an obsessive researcher of timepieces. He wasn't the type to believe in superstitions or ghost stories. But near the end, something shifted. The last time I saw him alive, he looked wrong, gaunt, paranoid. His once neat and combed hair had become a wild tangle of silver. His eyes darted around as if expecting someone or something to be watching. When I visited, I found his home in complete disarray. Books were stacked haphazardly, pages torn from journals, cryptic notes scrawled in ink across the walls. And in the center of it all stood the clock. It was an old grandfather clock, taller than me by at least a foot. The wood was dark, almost black, and it smelled of something ancient, something rotten. Its face was cracked slightly, but the glass still reflected light in a way that made it seem almost too clean. The pendulum swung with a soft whump, a slow, deliberate rhythm that filled the room. But the most unsettling thing, the hands moved backward, not like a broken clock, not erratically. It was smooth, controlled, as if it were keeping perfect time, just in reverse. I remember standing there, staring at it. Something about it made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. Uncle Robert had noticed me watching it and grabbed my wrist, his grip tight. His nails dug into my skin. "You can't take your eyes off it," he whispered. "If you do, it knows." A shiver ran through me. "What knows?" I asked, trying to pull away. But he wouldn't let go. His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw something in them I'll never forget. Raw fear. "It doesn't measure time," he said. "It takes it." A week later, he was dead. They found him sitting in his study, facing the clock. His body was slumped forward, his hands curled into his lap. But the thing that made the coroner hesitate, the thing that made my stomach drop when I heard about it, was that his body showed no signs of decay. None. He had been dead for 7 days, and yet he looked as if he had died mere hours before. They chalked it up to environmental factors. Low temperature, maybe something in the air that slowed decomposition. But I knew better. I knew it had something to do with that clock. After the funeral, the house became my problem. Uncle Robert didn't have kids, and my father had passed years ago. That left me as the closest living relative. The will was clear. The house and everything inside it belonged to me. I should have sold it. I should have left everything as it was and walked away. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. The first night I spent in that house, I heard the ticking. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. A steady tick, 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 always just loud enough that I couldn't completely tune it out. I tried to ignore it. I busied myself with sorting through Uncle Robert's things, trying to figure out what to keep and what to throw away. His journals were the first thing that caught my attention. There were hundreds of them, pages upon pages of notes, sketches, calculations. At first, they seemed like harmless academic ramblings, observations about historical timepieces, theories on clockwork mechanisms. But as I read further, the writing became more erratic. The same phrase, scrawled over and over again. Time is not what we think it is. And beneath one passage, a final desperate plea. Do not let it take you. I shuddered and closed the book. Then I heard it. A noise just beyond the study door. A slow, deliberate creak, like the sound of wood shifting under weight. I wasn't alone. Heart pounding, I grabbed the closest thing I could use as a weapon, a rusted fire poker leaning against the hearth, and moved toward the door. The hallway beyond was dark, stretching into shadows. I listened, straining to hear anything, but the house had fallen silent. No footsteps, no voices, just the sound of the clock. Tick, tick, tick. I turned back toward the study, and the clock had moved. Not the hands, the entire clock. It was closer. I swallowed hard. That wasn't possible. It had been against the far wall just minutes ago. I had been standing right there, and yet now it was just a few feet away from me. A sickly, crawling dread coiled in my stomach. I took a step back, gripping the fire poker so tightly my knuckles went white. The air in the room felt thicker, like I had stepped into something unseen. The kind of pressure you feel when a storm is about to break. Then the clock's hands began to move. Backward. Faster this time. The pendulum swung wildly, the ticking growing louder, more insistent. My vision blurred for a moment, my thoughts twisting as if something was pulling at me. And then I blinked. The clock was back in its original position. The air was normal again. The silence stretched, thick and unbroken. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Had I imagined it? I wanted to believe that. I wanted to tell myself that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I saw the journal on the desk. It was open to a page I hadn't read before. And in the center of the page, in my uncle's frantic handwriting, were the words, "If it moves, you're already losing time." I hardly slept that night. Even after I left the study, even after I locked my bedroom door, the sound of the clock followed me. I heard it behind the walls, beneath the floorboards, inside my head. Tick, tick, tick. It wasn't loud, just persistent. The kind of sound that, once you notice it, you can't unhear. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself that it was just a normal clock, that I was imagining things. But the longer I listened, the more I realized something was wrong, because the ticking wasn't steady. Sometimes it paused, sometimes it skipped forward, and sometimes, when the room was completely silent, I swore I heard something else underneath it. A whisper, a breath, something listening. I didn't sleep that night, and when the sun rose, I made a decision. I was going to destroy the clock. I wasn't an idiot. I knew it was just a clock with metal gears. Nothing supernatural. Nothing cursed. Nothing alive. But I also knew that it wasn't right. I could still feel it. Even outside the study, even in the morning light, the sense of wrongness clung to me like a fever. So I went to the garage and grabbed the heaviest tool I could find, a sledgehammer. I wasn't going to waste time. I wasn't going to overthink it. I was just going to smash the damn thing into splinters and be done with it. I marched back into the study, gripping the hammer with both hands. The clock stood exactly where it had been the night before, unmoving, almost as if it were waiting. The air around it felt thicker. I shook off the hesitation, raised the hammer, and swung. And then everything stopped. Not just the hammer, Not just me. Everything. The air. The sound. The world. It was like someone had pressed pause on reality itself. I stood there, frozen mid-swing, my muscles locked in place. The hammer was inches from the wood. My breath was caught in my chest. And in that silent, breathless moment, the clock spoke. Not with words, not with a voice, but with time itself. It was subtle at first, a flicker like déjà vu. I saw my own hand reverse its movement, the hammer pulling away instead of forward. My breath inhaled instead of exhaled. The dust I had kicked up in the air sank back to the floor. And then, like a rubber band snapping, time rewound. The hammer fell from my hands and landed back on the workbench in the garage. I was standing in the garage. I hadn't even entered the study yet. I gasped, stumbling backward. My heart slammed against my ribs. My breathing was too fast, too shallow. It had rewound me. It had undone my actions. I spun, sprinting back toward the study, toward the clock. And when I got there, it was waiting. It hadn't moved, but something felt different, like it had seen what I had tried to do. And it wasn't happy. I needed answers. I needed to know what the hell my uncle had gotten himself into, what the hell I was now caught up in. So I grabbed my phone and did something I hadn't done in years. I called Professor Henry Calloway. He had been one of Uncle Robert's closest colleagues, another historian obsessed with strange and unusual artifacts. The kind of man who spoke in whispers and always seemed to know more than he should. The call rang for a long time. Too long. Then, just when I thought it would go to voicemail, a hoarse voice answered. "Who is this?" "It's me," I said. "Daniel Caldwell." Silence. Then a slow intake of breath. "You found the clock," he said. I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. He already knew. "You need to listen to me, Daniel," he continued, his voice urgent. "I don't have time to explain everything, but you need to leave that house." I swallowed. "It's my uncle's house. It's my house now." "No," Calloway said. "It was never his, and it's not yours." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. "Professor, I need to know what's happening." "The clock, it's not a clock." The words hit me like ice water. "What do you mean it's not a clock?" I asked. Another silence. Then, in a whisper, he said, "It's a wound in time." My breath caught. "Your uncle found it years ago," Calloway continued. But he didn't know what it was at first. He thought it was an anomaly, a mechanical oddity. But the more he studied it, the more he realized it wasn't measuring time. It was stealing it. My mind reeled. That doesn't make any sense. "You've already felt it, haven't you?" he asked. The missing moments. The way time slips around it. It doesn't just tick, it feeds. A shudder ran through me. I tried to destroy it, I admitted. "But you can't," Calloway cut in. "Not with force. Not with fire. If you try, it will undo you before you can even lift a hand." I gripped the phone tighter. "Then how do I stop it?" A long pause. Then Calloway spoke one last time. "You don't," he said. "You run." And then the call cut off. I stood there, gripping my phone, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wanted to believe he was wrong. I wanted to believe that there was some way to fight this thing. But then I turned, and the clock was closer. Not by much, just a few inches, but enough that I knew. It had moved, and this time I hadn't looked away. A cold terror settled into my bones. I wasn't just losing time anymore. I was running out of it. I didn't run. I should have. I should have listened to Calloway and walked right out the door, never looking back. But something about the way the clock moved, something about the way it rewound time itself, made me hesitate. Because if the clock could undo time, could it also bring it back? Could it bring him back? I didn't leave the study for the rest of the day. I just sat there watching it. I needed to understand. I needed to know how it worked, how it chose, when to rewind things, what triggered it, what its limits were. But the longer I sat, the more I realized something. I wasn't just watching the clock. It was watching me. Not directly. It had no eyes, no face. But it was aware. I felt it in the way the room seemed smaller. How the air felt heavier. How the space between me and the clock seemed to shrink even though neither of us moved. And then I realized I hadn't eaten all day. I hadn't even felt hungry. I looked at my phone. The battery was still at 62%. It had been at 62% all day. I checked the time. The same minute flickered on the screen, over and over. I felt my breath catch. Time wasn't just slipping. It was breaking. The house was no longer in sync with the rest of the world, and I was trapped inside it. At some point, whether hours or minutes later, I heard footsteps. Not my own. Someone was upstairs. I felt my stomach drop. I was alone in the house, but the footsteps kept moving. Slow, deliberate. They creaked across the floor above me, one step at a time. Then they stopped, directly above me. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. And then the floor above me shifted, like something heavy had just leaned down, like it was listening. I grabbed my phone and dialed Callaway again. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. I forced myself to breathe. Forced myself to think. I wasn't going to sit here and let whatever was in the house come to me. I had to move. So I stepped out of the study, into the hallway, and looked up the stairs. The hallway light flickered. The upstairs landing was shrouded in shadow. And then a shape moved. Just a flicker, just a shifting of darkness. But it was there. Something was standing at the top of the stairs, watching me. A low, rasping breath filled the silence. Then, Daniel. It whispered my name. The voice wasn't normal. It wasn't deep or guttural or unnatural in the way horror movies make things sound. It was flat, emotionless, like someone saying my name in a language they barely understood. I backed away, my pulse pounding. The air thickened, pressing down on me like invisible hands. And then I saw it, just for a second, not clearly. Not fully, just a glimpse, a shadow unfolding from the darkness, long fingers stretching toward the banister, a face that wasn't a face, shifting and wrong, like something trying to remember what human features were supposed to look like. And then, tick, everything jumped backward. I was standing in the study again. The hallway was empty. The upstairs landing was silent. But I wasn't alone, because the clock was closer, and its hands were turning faster. I ran, not out of the house, I wish I had, but to the one place I might find answers. My uncle's office. The room was exactly as he had left it, papers stacked neatly, bookshelves filled with old leather-bound tomes. But I wasn't looking for books. I was looking for his words. And then I saw it, an old, battered journal sitting on his desk. I flipped it open, scanning the pages, and what I found made my blood run cold. March 5th. It won't let me leave. I've tried everything, burning it, breaking it, even locking it in the basement. But it always finds its way back. It always moves. I don't know how much time I've lost. Days? Weeks? It takes pieces of me, little by little. I see things that shouldn't be there. I hear voices speaking my name, voices that don't belong to anyone. And when I sleep, I dream of the things it's erased. I dream of the people it has taken. And I don't know if I was ever supposed to be here at all. If you're reading this, it means I'm already gone. I sat there, gripping the journal, my mind racing. The clock didn't just rewind time. It stole it. It had been feeding on my uncle. For how long? Had it erased him completely? Had it erased others? I turned the page, and my heart nearly stopped, because there at the bottom of the last entry, scrawled in ink that looked fresh, was one last sentence. It's still hungry. I slammed the journal shut, and then I felt something press against my back. Not a breath, not a whisper, a hand, cold, thin, not mine. I spun around, and the world snapped. The study was gone. The house was gone. I was somewhere else. Darkness stretched in every direction. The only thing in front of me was the clock, and for the first time, its hands were turning forward. I wasn't in the study anymore. I wasn't in the house. I wasn't anywhere that made sense. I turned in every direction, but there was only darkness, thick, suffocating, pressing in like a living thing. The air felt dead, like nothing had ever breathed here, like nothing ever could. And in front of me, standing alone in the void, was the clock. Its hands weren't moving backward anymore. They were turning forward. Fast. Too fast. Like time itself was unraveling, spinning out of control. And with every tick, I felt something pulling at me, tugging at the edges of my skin, my bones, my thoughts, like I wasn't solid anymore. Like I was coming apart. And then a voice. Do you remember? The voice wasn't human. It wasn't like the thing on the stairs. Either wasn't flat or distant. This voice was inside me. It whispered behind my ribs, curled around my thoughts, unraveling things I didn't even know I'd forgotten. Memories, fragments, flickering images of people I should have known. A woman with dark hair, laughing. A little boy running through a field. A hand holding mine. And then nothing. A blank space where something should have been. Something important. Something taken. The clock ticked louder. Do you remember? I staggered back, clutching my head. No, I whispered. But I knew that wasn't true. Because something deep inside me, some buried part of my soul, was screaming that I had remembered once. And the clock had taken it away. A rush of cold air hit me. The darkness shifted. And suddenly, there was a door where there hadn't been one before. A simple wooden door, standing alone in the void. It shouldn't have been possible. But somehow I knew if I didn't go through it, I would never leave. The clock ticked faster. The voice whispered again. Choose. I didn't think. I ran. I grabbed the handle, threw the door open, and stepped through. I was back in study. Or at least I thought I was. But something was wrong. The walls were the same. The bookshelves, the desk, the old wooden floor, everything was where it should be. And yet it wasn't. The air was thicker. The light was off, just slightly, like it wasn't coming from where it should be. And when I looked down at my hands for a second, just a flicker, they weren't mine. Too long, too thin, like something else had worn them before I did. And then a knock at the door. I turned slowly. The study door creaked open. And standing there was a man I didn't know. Or at least I thought I didn't. He was tall, thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes that looked like they belonged in a different century. His skin was pale, too pale, and his eyes. God, his eyes. They were empty, not black, not hollow, just blank, like they had never learned what light was supposed to look like. And when he smiled, it was wrong. Not because it was malicious, but because it was familiar. And then he said it, the words that made my blood freeze. You left me behind. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because suddenly I knew him. I didn't know how, but I did. His name was Elliot, and he was my brother. I had a brother. I had a brother, and the clock had erased him. Memories flooded back, too fast, too sudden, images of us as kids, running through the backyard, chasing fireflies, laughing until we couldn't breathe, and then nothing. An empty space where he used to be. A hole in my life, carved out by something that had no right to touch time. And now, he was standing in front of me. But he wasn't the same. Elliot was dead. Or worse, he was something the clock had made. And he wasn't here to be saved. He was here to take me back. The shadows behind him moved. Not like normal shadows. Like living things, shifting and writhing, stretching toward me with long, reaching fingers. The clock ticked louder. Elliot stepped forward. And in that moment, I understood. The clock hadn't just erased him. It had been erasing me, too, piece by piece. And if I didn't stop it, if I didn't find a way to break it, there wouldn't be anything left of me. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. Not when Elliot called my name. Not when the shadows chased me. I ran back to the study, toward the desk, toward the only thing I could think to do. I grabbed the clock, and I threw it to the floor. Glass shattered. Gears spilled across the wood. The shadows screamed. A high, wailing sound that didn't come from any throat, that didn't belong in this world. And for a second, just a second, I saw what was inside the clock. Not gears, not springs, not mechanics. Eyes. Hundreds of tiny, blinking eyes staring up at me from the broken remains. And then everything went black. I woke up in my car, parked outside the house. The front door was closed. The study window was dark. I checked my phone. The date was March 5th, the same day my uncle's journal had ended. But I knew it wasn't the same, because I could still feel it. Something watching me. Something waiting. And when I looked in the rearview mirror, for just a second, I saw Elliot sitting in the back seat, smiling. And then he was gone. But the whisper remained. It's still hungry. I didn't drive home. I sat in that car for hours, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, staring at the house, waiting. For what? For Elliot to come back? For the clock to pull me in again? For something worse? I don't know. But as the night stretched on, a horrible truth began to settle into my bones. This wasn't over. The clock was broken, but it wasn't dead, and neither was Elliot. Or at least, not anymore. When the sun finally rose, I did the only thing that made sense. I drove straight home and dug through the old boxes in my closet, searching for the one thing I had ignored since my uncle died, his final letter. I don't know why I never read it before. Maybe I was scared of what it would say. Maybe I already knew. But now, I tore it open with shaking hands and read the words meant for me. If you're reading this, it means the clock found you too. I'm sorry. I thought I had buried it deep enough, far enough away that it wouldn't reach you. But time isn't what we think it is, and neither is that thing. It's not just a clock. It never was. It's a door. A door is something that should never be opened. And every time it moves backward, something crawls a little closer. You need to listen carefully because you don't have much time. You have to finish what I couldn't. You have to lock the door for good. My hands were slick with sweat. There was more. A set of instructions, scrawled frantically at the bottom. And at the very end, don't let it take you to. I followed his instructions exactly. I didn't hesitate, didn't let myself think. Because if I did, I might start remembering that the thing in the clock wasn't gone, that I could still feel it breathing in the gaps between moments, curling around my thoughts like a snake in the dark. I packed the remains of the clock into a black box, wrapped in heavy cloth. I gathered salt, iron, and a mirror, the three things my uncle's letter said could hold time and place. And then I drove, not to a church, not to a graveyard, not to anywhere that made sense. I drove to the one place the clock couldn't follow. The old house burned down years ago, but the ground was still there. And according to my uncle, that was where the clock had been made. That was where it needed to die. I don't remember how long I dug. Could have been hours. Could have been minutes. Time didn't feel right anymore, not since that night. Not since I saw Elliot. But eventually, the hole was deep enough. I placed the black box inside, covered it with salt, then iron shavings, then the mirror, face down, and finally dirt, layer after layer, burying it beneath the earth, pressing down until it felt sealed, until it felt done. I whispered the last words from my uncle's letter, words that didn't feel like mine, words that made the air tremble. Time is not yours to take. Time is not yours to give. Time belongs to itself. The wind stopped. The world held its breath. And for a second, just a second, I thought it was over. I don't remember driving home, but I woke up in my bed hours later feeling empty, like something had been ripped out of me, like something had been watching. And then I saw it, a single piece of paper on my nightstand, yellowed, old, written in my uncle's handwriting. But this wasn't in the letter I had read. It wasn't in any of his letters. It was just one sentence, 9 words. You can bury it, but the clock still ticks. I don't know if I won. I don't know if I lost. I don't know if I really buried it, or if I just sent it deeper, waiting for someone else to find it like my uncle did. Like I did. But I do know one thing. When I checked the time on my phone, my heart nearly stopped. Because the date was wrong. March 5th. Again. Just like before. Like I had never left. Like I had never escaped. And in the silence of my room, as I sat there frozen, trying to convince myself it was just a glitch, I heard it. A tick. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from inside the walls. The clock was still here. And this time, it wasn't running backward. It was waiting. Waiting for me to run out of time.